The wind carried the scent of danger through the cottonwoods, as Tessa Fairchild peered over the rim of her coffee cup at the fading sunset. Her instincts, honed from 2 years alone on the Wyoming frontier, warned her that something wasn't right in the stillness that had settled over her small camp near Gold Hill. It was 1878, and the Wyoming Territory was still wild enough to make a woman think twice about staking a claim alone. But Tessa had never been one to shy away from a challenge, not since her father died and left her with nothing but his wagon, 2 horses, and a deed to land few believed was worth the paper it was printed on. She set down her tin cup and reached for the rifle that was never far from her side. The shadows between the trees seemed to move in ways they shouldn't. Her horses nickered nervously, pawing at the ground near where they were hitched. "Easy," she whispered, more to herself than to the anxious animals. The light from her small campfire cast dancing shadows across the clearing, making it difficult to distinguish movement from tricks of the light. The first shot came without warning, kicking up dirt just inches from her feet. Tessa dove behind her wagon as more bullets splintered the wood around her. "We know you're alone, lady," a rough voice called out. "Your claim papers and whatever gold you found, and maybe we'll let you live." Tessa's heart hammered against her ribs. She counted at least 3 distinct shooting positions. Outlaws. They'd been plaguing the mining settlements for months, preying on isolated prospectors and small camps. Now they'd found her. "I've got nothing worth taking," she shouted back, knowing it wouldn't matter. These men hadn't ridden out here for conversation. Another volley of shots answered her, and she heard the heavy footfalls of men advancing through the underbrush. Tessa fired twice in their direction, but in the gathering darkness, she was shooting blind. "You're just making this harder on yourself," another voice called, closer now. "We've got you surrounded." Tessa swallowed hard. She had maybe 10 bullets left and no way to escape. Her horses were too exposed to reach safely. She fired again and was rewarded with a grunt of pain, but it only seemed to enrage the others. "You'll pay for that," the first voice growled. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her heart sink further. More bandits joining the ambush. But something was different about this rider. He was coming fast. Too fast for someone trying to sneak up on a camp. The thundering approach grew louder until it seemed to shake the very ground. Then, to Tessa's astonishment, a single rider burst into the clearing, his dark silhouette backlit by the last crimson streaks of sunset. The stranger rode straight into the middle of the ambush, a revolver in each hand. What happened next left Tessa speechless. The mounted man spun his horse in a tight circle, firing with deadly precision. Each shot found its mark with uncanny accuracy. One outlaw fell, then another. The third tried to flee but crashed to the ground before he'd taken 3 steps. "There were 5, the stranger called out, his voice deep and steady. 2 more in the trees to the west." As if to confirm his words, gunfire erupted from the direction he'd indicated. The stranger wheeled his horse and fired twice more. The shots were answered by the dull thud of bodies hitting the forest floor. Silence fell over the clearing. The stranger dismounted in one fluid motion, his boots barely making a sound as they touched the earth. He approached Tessa's position slowly, holstering one pistol but keeping the other ready. "You can come out now, madam. They won't be troubling you anymore." Tessa rose cautiously from behind the wagon, her rifle still raised. The firelight revealed a tall man with broad shoulders and a face weathered by sun and wind. He couldn't have been more than 30, with dark hair that fell to his shoulders beneath a dust-covered hat. "Who are you?" she demanded, not quite ready to lower her weapon. "Name's Mason Reed." He tipped his hat slightly. "Was tracking those men for the better part of 3 days. They've hit half a dozen camps between here and Cheyenne. Tessa studied him carefully. His clothes were trail-worn but of good quality. The badge pinned to his vest caught the firelight a marshal's star. "You're a long way from anywhere, Marshal Reed." He nodded, holstering his remaining pistol. "Justice doesn't much care about distance, miss." "Fairchild, Tessa Fairchild." She finally lowered her rifle, though she kept it in her hands. "That was some shooting." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Been doing it a long time." Tessa glanced at the bodies scattered around her camp. "What happens now? Now I help you move your camp. These men had friends and this spot isn't safe anymore." He looked around at her modest setup. "You're prospecting." "My father was. I'm just trying to prove up his claim." Mason nodded thoughtfully. "There's a creek about 2 miles east. Better water, better protection. We can move tonight if you're willing." Tessa wanted to refuse. She'd been taking care of herself since her father died, but the pragmatic part of her knew he was right. This place wasn't safe, and traveling with a marshal was certainly safer than being alone. "I suppose I should thank you for saving my life, Marshal Reed." "Mason," he corrected, "and no thanks needed, just doing what's right." He moved to check on his horse, a magnificent black stallion that stood calmly despite the recent gunfire. "We should move quickly. Night's coming on fast." Within an hour, they had packed up her small camp and were heading east through the darkness. Tessa rode her chestnut mare while Mason led the way, occasionally glancing back to make sure she was keeping up. Her wagon followed behind, pulled by her second horse. "How long have you been out here alone?" Mason asked after they'd been riding in silence for some time. "Almost 2 years, since my father died." "That's a long time to be on your own in this country." Tessa straightened in her saddle. "I manage just fine. I can see that." There was respect in his voice, not condescension. Not many would have stood their ground against 5 armed men. Not many would have ridden straight into an ambush, either, she countered. "Were you always such a good shot, or did the marshal's badge come with special abilities?" The sound of his low chuckle surprised her. It was a warm sound, unexpected from a man who dispatched 5 outlaws without hesitation. "My father taught me to shoot when I was barely tall enough to hold a pistol. Said a man should never pull a gun unless he intends to hit what he's aiming at." Wise advice. He had his moments. Something in Mason's tone suggested a complicated history. They reached the creek just as the moon rose, casting silver light across a small clearing surrounded by thick pines and cottonwoods. It was indeed a better position, with the creek on one side and rocky terrain at their backs. "We'll make camp here," Mason said, dismounting. "I'll take the first watch." "I can take a watch too," Tessa insisted. "I'm not helpless." Mason studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I'll wake you at midnight." As they set up the camp, Tessa found herself watching the marshal when he wasn't looking. There was an efficiency to his movements, a quiet confidence that spoke of years spent in the wilderness. He wasn't like the rough miners and cowboys she'd encountered in Gold Hill. There was something different about him, a steadiness, a certainty in his actions. After a simple meal of beans and jerky, Mason took up a position at the edge of camp, his back against a tree and his eyes scanning the darkness. "Get some rest," he told her. "Dawn comes early." Tessa lay in her bedroll, listening to the gentle sound of the creek and the occasional shifting of the horses. Despite the events of the evening, she felt strangely at ease. Perhaps it was the exhaustion catching up with her, or perhaps it was knowing that Mason Reed was standing guard. Either way, she drifted into a dreamless sleep. She awoke to his hand on her shoulder, gentle but firm. "Your watch," he said quietly. Tessa nodded, rubbing sleep from her eyes and reaching for her rifle. "Anything I should know?" "All quiet so far, but keep your ears open. Coyotes have been calling to the north." She took up the position he'd vacated, watching as he settled into his own bedroll. Within minutes, His breathing had deepened. Tessa found herself studying his face in repose. The hard lines softened in sleep, making him look younger. The night passed without incident, and as the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, Tessa built up the fire to make coffee. The aroma seemed to rouse Mason, who sat up and ran a hand through his dark hair. "Morning," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "Morning." She handed him a cup of the strong brew. "Thought you might need this." Their fingers brushed as he took the cup, and Tessa felt an unexpected warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee. She turned away quickly, busying herself with preparing a simple breakfast. "What's your plan, Miss Fairchild?" Mason asked after a few minutes of companionable silence. "Gold Hill isn't exactly thriving these days." Tessa sighed. "I know, but my father believed in that claim, said there was a vein of gold that would make us rich if we could just find it." She shook her head. "Probably just the dreams of a dying man, but I promised I'd try." "Promises matter," Mason agreed, surprising her. "How much longer will you give it?" "Until winter, at least. Then I'll have to decide." Mason nodded thoughtfully. "I need to deliver those outlaws' bodies to the sheriff in Laramie, report what happened. But I can escort you back to your claim first, make sure it's secure." Tessa wanted to refuse to insist she didn't need his help, but the memory of the ambush was still fresh. "I'd appreciate that, Marshal." "Mason," he reminded her. "Mason," she echoed, finding she liked the way his name felt on her lips. They broke camp efficiently and headed back toward Gold Hill. The journey took most of the day, with Mason occasionally riding ahead to scout the trail. By late afternoon, they reached her claim, a modest patch of land with a small, half-built cabin and a shallow mining pit. "It's not much," Tessa admitted as they approached, "but it's mine, or it will be once I've proven it up." Mason dismounted and surveyed the property. "You've done good work here. That cabin's solid. My father started it. I've been trying to finish it bit by bit." He walked to the mining pit and knelt, examining the rock and soil with experienced eyes. "Your father might not have been wrong about the gold." Tessa's heart quickened. "What do you mean, these quartz formations? They're similar to what they found in the big strike over in South Pass." He picked up a chunk of rock, turning it in his hands. "Might be worth having an assayer take a look." "Really?" Tessa couldn't keep the hope from her voice. "I've been digging where my father marked, but I haven't found anything that looked promising. Sometimes it takes a trained eye." He handed her the rock. "Keep this one." They set about making camp, and Tessa found herself watching Mason as he worked. There was something comforting about his presence, a sense of security she hadn't felt in a long time. "I'll need to head to Laramie tomorrow," he said as they sat by the fire that evening. "Those bodies need to be reported, and the sheriff will want to know about the Outlaws' operation." "Of course." Tessa tried to hide her disappointment. "I understand." Mason studied her across the flames. "I could come back after I've made my report." "You don't need to do that. I'm sure you have other duties." "I do," he acknowledged, "but I also have some discretion in how I use my time." He paused. Those outlaws were part of a larger gang. Their friends might come looking when they don't return. Tessa knew he was right, but it wasn't just concern for her safety that made her heart lift at the thought of his return. In just one day, Mason Reed had become more than just the man who'd saved her life. There was a connection between them, something neither had spoken of but both seemed to feel. "If you think it's necessary," she said carefully, "I wouldn't object to your checking in, for safety's sake." The smile that crossed his face was brief but genuine. "For safety's sake," he agreed. The next morning, Mason prepared to leave at first light. He'd already secured the bodies of the outlaws on a pack horse, covered with a tarp. "I should be back within 5 days," he told her as he mounted his horse. "Keep your rifle close, and if anyone approaches that you don't know, Don't hesitate to defend yourself. I survived 2 years out here before you came along, Marshal Reed, Tessa reminded him, though there was no bite in her words. I think I can manage 5 days. I have no doubt. His eyes held hers for a moment longer than necessary. Still, be careful, Miss Fairchild. Tessa, she said impulsively. If I'm to call you Mason, then you should call me Tessa. He tipped his hat, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Tessa, then. I'll see you soon. She watched him ride away, the bodies of the outlaws in tow, until he disappeared over the ridge. The claim suddenly felt emptier than it had in months. The days passed slowly as Tessa worked on her cabin and checked the mining pit. She found herself thinking about Mason more often than she cared to admit, wondering where he was, if he was safe, when exactly he would return. On the afternoon of the 4th day, she was fetching water from the nearby stream when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Her heart quickened as she reached for her rifle, but the familiar silhouette of Mason on his black stallion soon appeared, and she lowered the weapon with a smile she couldn't suppress. "You're early," she called out as he rode up. "Made good time." He dismounted, leading his horse to the water. "No trouble while I was gone, none at all. Just the usual coyotes, boredom, and rocks that refuse to contain gold." Mason laughed, a sound Tessa realized she'd been looking forward to hearing again. "About that, I brought someone with me." For the first time, Tessa noticed the second rider approaching, an older man with a gray beard and spectacles, leading a mule laden with equipment. "This is Elijah Parker," Mason introduced him. "Best assayer in the territory. Thought he might take a look at your claim." The older man tipped his hat. "Miss Fairchild, the marshal here was mighty insistent that I come see this property of yours. Said your father might have been onto something." Tessa looked at Mason in surprise. "You didn't mention you were bringing an assayer." "Wanted it to be a surprise," he replied with a slight smile. "Elijah owes me a favor from a while back. Saved my life during an Indian raid in '73, the older man explained. Figured the least I could do was look at some rocks for him." Tessa felt a surge of gratitude toward Mason. "Well, Mr. Parker, I'd be most grateful for your expertise. The mining pit is just over there." The assayer spent the remainder of the day examining her father's dig, collecting samples and occasionally muttering to himself. Mason helped Tessa with repairs to the cabin roof, working beside her with an easy companionship that felt remarkably natural. "Sheriff was pleased about those outlaws," Mason told her as they worked. "Said they'd been terrorizing prospectors all through the territory. There's a reward, not much, but it might help with supplies." "A reward? But you're the one who tracked them down." "You were the one they were shooting at," he pointed out. "Besides, I get paid a salary. You're the one trying to make a go of this claim." Tessa paused in her work, studying him. "Why are you doing all this, Mason? The assayer, the reward. You barely know me." He was quiet for a moment, securing a beam before answering. "When I rode into your camp that night, I wasn't expecting to find someone like you. Most folks out here, they're running from something or chasing something. But you're standing your ground, honoring a promise." He met her gaze. "That's rare, worth protecting." The simple honesty of his words touched something deep inside her. Before she could respond, Elijah called up to them from below. "Think you two might want to come see this." They climbed down from the roof and followed the assayer to the mining pit. He held out several rock samples, pointing to flecks embedded in the quartz. "See that? That's gold, all right. Not just trace amounts either. This vein looks promising, runs deep from what I can tell." He adjusted his spectacles. "Your father was right, Miss Fairchild. There's gold here. Not enough to make you rich overnight, but with proper mining you could do well for yourself." Tessa stared at the rocks in disbelief, then up at Mason, who was watching her with a warm smile. "I told you your father might have been onto something," he said quietly. That evening, as they sat around the fire, Elijah explained what would be needed to properly develop the claim. The initial excitement had given way to practical concerns: equipment, labor, protection. "Mining isn't easy work, especially for a woman alone," the assayer warned. "She's not alone," Mason said before Tessa could respond. Both she and Elijah looked at him in surprise. "I mean," he continued, somewhat awkwardly, "she has people looking out for her." Later, after Elijah had retired to the tent they'd set up for him, Tessa and Mason sat alone by the fire. "Did you mean what you said?" she asked softly. "About me not being alone?" Mason poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks into the night air. "I've been thinking. My circuit takes me through Gold Hill regularly. I could check in, help with the mining when I'm here." "Why would you do that?" He looked up at her, the firelight casting shadows across his face. "Because in all my years of riding these trails, I've never met anyone quite like you, Tessa Fairchild." The way he said her name made her heart beat faster. "I'm just a woman trying to keep a promise. You're a woman carving out a life in a place where most men fear to tread alone." He set down the stick. "I admire that. I admire you." The admission hung between them, honest and unadorned. Tessa found herself moving closer to him, drawn by something neither of them had put into words. "I think I might admire you too, Mason Reed," she whispered. "Even if your arrival was rather dramatic." His laugh was soft. "I've never been accused of subtlety." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, shoulders almost touching, watching the flames dance. "What if," Tessa began hesitantly, "what if I said I'd welcome your help? With the claim, I mean. Then I'd say you're showing good sense." His hand found hers in the darkness. "And I'd be honored." The touch of his fingers around hers felt right, as if they'd known each other far longer than the few days they'd spent together. Tessa knew she should be more cautious. A woman alone on the frontier couldn't afford to trust easily, but there was something about Mason Reed that defied her usual wariness. "It won't be easy," she warned. "Mining is hard work, and this land isn't forgiving. Nothing worth having comes easy." He squeezed her hand gently. "Get some rest, Tessa. Tomorrow we can start planning." The next few weeks brought changes to Tessa's claim that she could scarcely have imagined. With Elijah's guidance and Mason's help during his visits, they began to properly develop the mine. The gold wasn't abundant, but it was steady, enough to purchase proper equipment and hire 2 reliable men from Gold Hill to assist with the digging when Mason was away on his marshal duties. Summer turned to fall, and with each visit, Mason stayed a little longer. They fell into a rhythm, working side by side during the day and talking by the fire at night. He told her of his life before becoming a marshal, his childhood in Missouri, losing his mother to cholera, his father teaching him to track and shoot. She shared stories of her own past, growing up in Pennsylvania, her mother's death, following her father west in search of a new beginning. As the weeks passed, Tessa's cabin began to feel more like a home. Mason built proper furniture: a table, chairs, a rocking chair for the porch. The mining operation grew more established, and word spread about the Gold Hill claim that was turning a steady profit. It was late October when riders approached the claim one afternoon while Tessa was alone. The 2 hired miners had gone to town for supplies, and Mason wasn't due back for another day. She reached for her rifle, remembering all too well the ambush months before. 3 men rode into view, rough-looking and heavily armed. Tessa stood on the porch of her now completed cabin, rifle ready but not yet raised. "Afternoon, gentlemen," she called out, keeping her voice steady. "What brings you to my claim?" The lead rider, a burly man with a scar across his cheek, reined in his horse. "Heard there was gold being pulled out of this hillside. Thought we might get a look." "This is private property," Tessa replied. "Properly registered and filed. If you're looking to stake a claim, there's land available 2 ridges over." The men exchanged glances. "We ain't much interested in staking our own claim," the scarred man said. "More interested in what's already producing." Tessa raised her rifle slightly. "Then I'm afraid you've wasted your time. This claim isn't for sale." "Who said anything about buying?" The man's hand moved toward his pistol. Before he could draw, the thunder of approaching hooves drew everyone's attention. Mason appeared over the ridge, riding hard, his badge catching the afternoon sun. The outlaws tensed, clearly recognizing the marshal's star. "Afternoon, boys," Mason called out, his voice deceivingly casual as he reined in beside Tessa. "Lost your way," the scarred man forced a smile. "Just having a friendly conversation with the lady here." "Is that right?" Mason's hand rested casually near his holster. "Funny, it looked to me like you were about to try something foolish." "We don't want trouble with the law," one of the other men said nervously. "Then I suggest you ride on," Mason replied. "This claim is protected by the law and by me personally." Word's gotten around about what happened to the last group that tried to cause trouble here. The tension stretched for several long seconds before the scarred man spat on the ground. "Come on, boys, plenty of other claims around." They rode off, glancing back over their shoulders until they disappeared from view. Tessa lowered her rifle with a shaky breath. That was close. Too close. Mason dismounted, his expression grim. "They'll be back or others like them. Word spreading about your gold. What do we do?" Mason looked at the cabin, the mine, and then back at her. Something in his expression had changed. "Tessa, I need to ask you something." Her heart quickened at his tone. "What is it? These past months, working beside you, getting to know you." He removed his hat, running a hand through his hair in an uncharacteristically nervous gesture. "I've come to care for you, more than I thought possible." Tessa felt warmth spread through her chest. "Mason, let me finish, please." He took a deep breath. "I know it hasn't been that long, but in this country, people learn to recognize what's real pretty quick. What I feel for you is real." He stepped closer, taking her hands in his. "I can protect you better, help you with this claim better if I'm here all the time. And truth be told, I want to be here all the time. With you." Tessa looked up at him, this man who had ridden into her life like thunder and changed everything. "Are you asking what I think you're asking? I'm asking if you'd consider becoming Mrs. Mason Reed. If you'd let me build a life here with you." His eyes held hers, vulnerable yet certain. "I love you, Tessa Fairchild. Have since that first night by the creek, I think." Tears sprang to her eyes as joy welled up inside her. "I love you too, Mason. I've been falling in love with you a little more with each visit." "Is that a yes?" he asked, a smile beginning to form on his lips. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." He pulled her into his arms then, his kiss gentle at first, then deepening with all the emotion they'd held back for months. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. "What about your martial duties?" Tessa asked, suddenly remembering the badge he wore. "I've been thinking about that. There's talk of forming a proper sheriff's office in Gold Hill now that the mine is bringing more people to town. I could put in for the position." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Would still be upholding the law, but I'd be home every night." The word home made Tessa smile wider. "I like the sound of that." They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Gold Hill, with Elijah Parker as Mason's best man and the local schoolteacher, who had become Tessa's friend, standing up for her. The entire town turned out for the celebration, impressed by the union of the formidable Miss Fairchild and the renowned Marshal Reed. As winter settled over the Wyoming Territory, the newly married couple expanded the cabin, adding another room and improving the infrastructure of the mine. Mason was appointed sheriff of Gold Hill, as he'd hoped, allowing him to continue upholding the law while remaining close to home and helping with the mining operation. Word of Marshal Reed's marksmanship and what had happened to the outlaws who ambushed Tessa's camp spread through the territory, and few were foolish enough to cause trouble at the Reed claim. Those who did quickly learned why Mason's reputation as a lawman who never missed a shot was well deserved. By spring, the mine was producing enough gold to ensure their comfort, if not extravagant wealth. More importantly, they had each other, and the home they were building together, a home filled with love, respect, and the promise they'd made to stand by each other. On a warm evening in late April, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the hills with gold, Tessa rested her head on Mason's shoulder. "You ever think about that night?" she asked. "When you rode in and saved me from those outlaws?" Mason's arm tightened around her. "Sometimes. Mostly I think about how lucky I was to find you." "Lucky?" She smiled up at him. "I thought you didn't believe in luck." "I believe in fate," he corrected, kissing her forehead. "And fate brought me over that ridge just in time to see the woman I was meant to spend my life with." "Quite the romantic for a hard-edged lawman," Tessa teased. "Only with you." His hand moved to rest on her stomach, where the first signs of their child had begun to show. "Only ever with you." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across their land, Tessa marveled at how much had changed in less than a year. From a woman alone, fighting to honor her father's dream, to a wife and soon-to-be mother with a thriving claim and a husband she adored. The wilderness that had once seemed so threatening now felt like home, and the man beside her who had ridden into her life like thunder that fateful night was the reason why. The years that followed brought both challenges and joys to the Reeds of Gold Hill. Their first child, a son they named Thomas after Tessa's father, was born the following winter during one of the worst blizzards the territory had seen in decades. Mason had ridden through the storm to fetch the doctor from town, nearly freezing in the process, but arriving just in time. The mine continued to produce steady gold, and they invested wisely, buying additional land and establishing themselves as one of the founding families of the growing settlement. Mason's reputation as a fair but uncompromising sheriff helped Gold Hill develop into a respectable town rather than the rough mining camp it might have become. 2 years after Thomas was born, they welcomed a daughter, Elizabeth, followed by another son, James, 3 years later. Their family grew alongside their prosperity, and the cabin that had once seemed so empty to Tessa was now filled with laughter and life. Mason never lost his skill with a gun, though he had less cause to use it as the territory became more settled. Still, old-timers in Gold Hill would tell newcomers the story of the marshal who rode in like thunder and never missed a shot, saving the woman who would become his wife from certain death. Tessa continued to work the claim alongside her husband, proving that a woman's determination could be just as valuable as a man's strength in taming the frontier. Together, they built not just a fortune in gold, but something far more precious, a legacy of love and perseverance that would endure long after the gold had been spent. And on quiet nights, when the children were asleep and the Wyoming wind whistled around their sturdy home, Mason and Tessa would sit on their porch, hands intertwined, and marvel at the journey that had brought them together, a journey that began with danger and gunfire, but led to a lifetime of happiness neither could have imagined on that fateful evening when outlaws ambushed her camp and changed their lives forever. By 1898, 20 years after that night, Gold Hill had grown into a proper town with a school, several churches, and businesses lining its main street. The Reeds were respected pillars of the community, their children now young adults making their own way in a world that had changed dramatically since their parents' frontier days. Thomas, their eldest, had followed in his father's footsteps, becoming a deputy marshal in the now established state of Wyoming. Elizabeth had married the son of the town banker and was expecting her first child. James, their youngest, showed his grandfather's passion for prospecting and had already staked his own claim in the hills beyond Gold Hill. Mason had retired as sheriff 5 years earlier, focusing his attention on managing their mining interests and the cattle ranch they'd established on the additional land they'd acquired. His hair had turned silver at the temples, and the lines around his eyes had deepened, but he still sat tall in the saddle and could outshoot men half his age when the occasion called for it. Tessa, whose auburn hair was now streaked with gray, had become known throughout the region for her knowledge of mining operations and her fearlessness in a male-dominated industry. Women seeking their own independence often sought her advice, and she gave it freely, remembering her own struggles in those early days. On the 20th anniversary of the night they met, Mason surprised Tessa with a gift, a small gold locket containing a pressed wildflower from the creek, where they'd made their first camp together after the ambush. "I've kept this all these years," he told her as they sat on the porch of their large, comfortable home that had replaced the original cabin. "Picked it the morning after we camped by that creek. Thought it might remind me of you when I rode to Laramie." Tessa opened the locket, touching the delicate preserved blossom with wonder. "All this time, I knew even then," Mason admitted. "Knew you were the one I'd been looking for without realizing it." She leaned against him, the years falling away as she remembered the young marshal who had appeared out of nowhere to save her life. "Did you really never miss a shot that night?" Mason chuckled. "Not a one. Couldn't afford to with you watching." "Showing off for a lady," she teased. "Maybe a little," he kissed her softly. "Worth it, though." As the sun set over the Wyoming hills, painting the sky in the same colors as the night they'd met, Mason and Tessa Reed reflected on the life they'd built together, a life forged in the fires of danger and necessity, but sustained by a love that had only deepened with time. The frontier had changed around them, tamed by railroads and telegraph wires, but the spirit that had brought them together remained as strong as ever. They had faced outlaws and blizzards, boom times and hardship, always side by side, always moving forward together. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't ridden over that ridge that night?" Tessa asked. Mason was quiet for a moment, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "No," he finally said, "because I couldn't have done anything else. Some things are meant to be, Tessa. We were meant to be." And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Tessa knew he was right. From that first moment of thunder and gunfire, their paths had been irrevocably joined, creating a story of love and courage that would be told in Gold Hill for generations to come, the story of a determined woman who kept her promise, and the lawman who rode in like thunder and never missed a shot.